Nobody inside the paddock expected the numbers to look like this. What began as a routine data comparison quietly turned into one of the most uncomfortable conversations Ducati engineers had all season, because buried inside the braking traces was something that didn't align with MotoGP logic at all, something that didn't fit their models, their simulations, or their assumptions, and it belonged to Toprak Razgatlıoğlu. At first, the reaction was disbelief, then confusion, and finally a question no one was ready to answer yet. How could a rider outside MotoGP be braking in a way that defied Ducati's own prototype data? And that was only the beginnings. Behind closed doors, Ducati's performance engineers are used to surprises. MotoGP is built on constant discovery, marginal gains, and brutal honesty from numbers that never lie. But when Toprak's braking data was laid over Ducati's MotoGP reference traces, the room reportedly went quiet, not because it was faster everywhere, not because it was perfect, but because it was fundamentally different. The braking zones were shorter, the initial deceleration spike was sharper, and most unsettling of all, the release phase, the moment where riders normally pay the highest price, looked unnaturally controlled. Ducati's MotoGP riders typically manage braking by loading the front tire progressively, trusting carbon discs and aero downforce to keep everything stable. Toprak, however, appeared to be doing something else entirely. What stunned engineers wasn't just that he braked later, plenty of riders do that. It was that his bike settled faster. The instability window, the dangerous moment where the bike dances on the edge of control, was smaller than expected. According to insiders, the data suggested he was finishing braking with less front-end stress than Ducati's own MotoGP benchmarks. And that raised an unsettling thought. If this wasn't an error, then MotoGP might not be using braking as efficiently as it believed. But to understand why this was happening, Ducati had to look far beyond spreadsheets and sensors. Toprak Razgatlıoğlu didn't learn braking in a factory program. He didn't grow up refining carbon disc technique or aero-assisted deceleration. His foundation was chaos, dirt bikes, stunt riding, endless hours learning how to stop a machine that actively wants to throw you off. Long before he was a world SBK champion, Toprak learned to trust the rear of the bike more than the front. He learned how to make instability work for him instead of against him. Where most riders fear rear movement under braking, Toprak invites it, then controls it. In World SBK, this style became his signature. Fans saw the dramatic rear lift, the bike pitching forward, the impossible-looking saves, but what many missed was the precision underneath. His braking wasn't reckless. It was deliberate, every movement calculated, every slide managed. For years, rivals dismissed it with a simple argument. That won't work in MotoGP. Prototype bikes are heavier on the front under braking. Carbon discs demand different inputs. Aero punishes mistakes instantly. The belief was almost unanimous. Toprak's style was spectacular but incompatible. Ducati's data was now quietly challenging that belief. Because instead of collapsing under MotoGP-level forces, his braking traces showed balance, control, and something else that worried engineers even more: repeatability. This wasn't a one-off lap. And that forced Ducati to compare him directly with their own riders. When Toprak's braking traces were stacked against Ducati's MotoGP reference points, the expectation was simple. He would lose time on entry, he would overload the front. The numbers would explain why MotoGP remained a different world. Instead, they revealed something far more uncomfortable. Toprak's entry speed drop-off was smaller than predicted. His deceleration curve peaked aggressively, then stabilized earlier. While MotoGP riders often brake deep into the corner to manage turn-in, Toprak appeared to complete the majority of braking before committing to lean, yet still arrived at the apex with competitive speed. Engineers noticed something else. His brake pressure release was smoother, not slower, smoother. Where Ducati's MotoGP riders showed microcorrections, likely compensating for front tire load and aero interference, Toprak's release curve looked clean, almost calm. One specific corner analysis reportedly changed the entire tone of the discussion. In a heavy braking zone where Ducati's MotoGP data showed unavoidable front-end stress spikes, Toprak's trace remained flatter, more controlled, less violent. That corner forced an uncomfortable realization. This wasn't about bravery, it was about technique. And the key difference wasn't at the front of the bike. The rear brake had always been part of Toprak's story, but Ducati's data finally quantified its impact. Under extreme braking, Toprak wasn't just slowing the bike, he was shaping its attitude. By using the rear brake aggressively but precisely, he stabilized the chassis before the front tire reached its limit. The result was counterintuitive: less front-end overload at peak deceleration, less chaotic movement when releasing the brakes, and more confidence to commit earlier to corner entry. In MotoGP, rear brake use exists, but it's often secondary, a support tool. Ducati's philosophy, like much of the paddock, prioritizes front-end dominance, carbon discs, aero downforce, maximum load, maximum grip. Toprak's data suggested another path, one where rear brake input wasn't a backup but a primary stabilizer. This contradicted years of MotoGP development thinking, and that's where the tension began to build. Because acknowledging this wasn't just about admiring Toprak's skill. It meant questioning whether MotoGP bikes, including Ducati's dominant machine, had been optimized around a narrow interpretation of braking. And inside Ducati, not everyone was ready to go there. Ducati's success is built on confidence. Confidence in their bike, their philosophy, their process. They are the benchmark for a reason, but success can also create blind spots, and some insiders reportedly felt this data was walking dangerously close to one. A deeper investigation into Toprak's braking would inevitably raise questions. Could current riders benefit from a different approach? Were setups limiting alternative styles? Had development priorities unintentionally discouraged techniques that didn't fit the dominant model? Some engineers wanted to explore further. Simulations, experiments, controlled comparisons, others urged restraint. MotoGP success isn't theoretical, it's proven on Sundays, and Ducati was winning. There was also a human element. Suggesting that an external rider's technique outperformed internal norms risked unsettling riders who were already operating under immense pressure. Confidence is fragile at this level. So officially nothing changed. No statements, no announcements, no acknowledgement. But unofficially, the paddock was already whispering. As word leaked that Toprak's braking data had raised eyebrows inside Ducati, speculation spread fast. Rival teams took interest. Engineers quietly revisited their own assumptions. Analysts debated whether MotoGP's braking philosophy had become too standardized. Fans, meanwhile, reacted instantly. Social media lit up with clips, slow-motion breakdowns, and bold claims that MotoGP wasn't ready for Toprak. Others pushed back, arguing the bike mattered more than the rider and that data without context meant nothing. What fueled the conversation was silence. Ducati didn't deny the reports, they didn't confirm them either, and in MotoGP, silence is rarely accidental. Career speculation followed naturally. If Toprak's braking could translate this effectively, then the biggest questions surrounding his MotoGP future began to shift. It was no longer about whether he could adapt. It was about whether MotoGP teams were prepared to adapt to him. But the most revealing detail in the data still hadn't fully surfaced. Hidden deep in the analysis was a subtle but critical point. Toprak's braking wasn't just effective, it was sustainable. Lap after lap, the traces remained consistent. Tire degradation didn't spike. Front temperature remained within a controllable window. That detail changed everything. Because MotoGP isn't won on one spectacular lap. It's won by repeating performance under pressure, heat, and fatigue. And Toprak's numbers suggested his style didn't just survive those conditions, it thrived in them. Suddenly, the narrative flipped. What was once considered a liability now looked like an untapped advantage. Not because it ignored MotoGP physics, but because it worked with them differently. The question facing the paddock became unavoidable. If one rider's braking style could expose gaps in the most advanced machines on the grid, what else had been overlooked? In the bigger picture, Toprak's braking data wasn't a threat. It was a mirror. It reflected the possibility that MotoGP's relentless optimization had narrowed its imagination. Ducati's dominance hadn't failed, but it may have hidden alternative performance paths waiting to be explored. No one knows yet whether Toprak will step into MotoGP and rewrite the rulebook. No one knows if his braking style would remain intact under full prototype pressure. What is clear is that the data has already done something irreversible. It forced MotoGP to question itself. And in a championship built on certainty, nothing is more disruptive than numbers that refuse to behave.